Okay, let's go to our panel. Joining us from Kiev via Skype is Valentin Yakushik. He is a professor of political science and political analyst. From New York, we are joined by Andrij Dobriansky. He is a director of communications and media with the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Also joining us from London is Russian commentator and analyst Alexander Nekrassov. He is a former advisor to the Kremlin. And with us too from Athens is Ulrich Bruckner. He is EU Jean Monnet professor at Stanford University in Berlin. Welcome to all of you. Andrij Dobriansky, let me start with you. President Zelensky and the Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to, quote, a full and comprehensive ceasefire by the end of the year. But there are some serious issues that are outstanding. But would you consider these talks a success?
I think they're a first step. I think that President Putin probably got rocked on his heels a little bit, not understanding quite what President Volodymyr Zelensky is. I don't think the rest of the world knows. He's one of the youngest presidents out there, doesn't have a long political history, so it's hard to read him. We know from President Zelensky's private press conference at the end of the day that he was pushing President Putin not about the war, but actually on gas trade. He would like to see a cessation of these annual renegotiations and have a 10-year deal with President Putin and not have Europe be subjected to the whims of Russia. And I think that will really play towards the internal politics of the EU, with Germany really pushing for this Nord Stream pipeline and France really trying to show, Macron really trying to show that he will be the future leader of the EU once Angela Merkel leaves her post next year.
So, Andrei, would it be fair to say that all sides that were involved in these talks would like to see an end to the conflict in order to get their economic trade relations back on track?
Well, I know definitely that Russia would like the economic trade negotiations. They would like to have be able to sell their goods back in Russia and actually purchase things from the EU. However, given the fact that 3 Ukrainian service members were killed in action yesterday by snipers, the fact that Russia has solicited new recruits from the local population, young men and women, to be youth snipers, that just started in the last month in eastern Ukraine. This does not show a side to the negotiations that's interested in peace. It's just more ramping up by Russia, and let the chips fall as they may.
Valentin Yakushik, President Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine earlier this year with a promise to end that war in eastern Ukraine. He said that the Paris meetings were a good step forward, but lots more needs to be resolved. What's your take on the outcome of the talks?
President Zelensky is limited in his capacities to implement his promises, as he has very strong pressures from the people from the previous regime and from the radical nationalists. Zelensky would be ready to implement Minsk Accords, as most Ukrainians understand we need to make necessary concessions. Ukraine is in a difficult economic, political situation. We need to have peace. But radicals and the previous regime who signed Minsk Accords, President Poroshenko signed the Minsk agreements, but now he said, no, it's a betrayal to implement Minsk agreement. So they are pressing, and it's a destabilizing force. So Zelensky has to make some smart steps. He uses very strong words towards Russia, towards separatists, and shows that there are some limits to which extent he can implement Minsk Accord. It's for internal consumption, Ukrainian consumption, that we do not have destabilization, as there are 2 possible destabilizing points. One, on peace accord, when we have a lot of radicals who do not want to make any concessions. And another, President Zelensky is making a very big mistake when now he is ready to introduce some neo-colonial type of decision on the sale of arable land, on agricultural land. And here there is another very strong opposition movement,
right,
which is led by Yulia Tymoshenko. So he has to be very cautious on the peace issues, as very soon he will have strongest protest as possible in the nearest weeks.
All right.
And
Yeah, Alexander Nekrassov, this is how President Putin described the talks. Let's listen.
This is certainly an important step towards de-escalating the situation in eastern Ukraine, as well as easing tensions.
Alexander, Russia has denied being involved in supporting the pro-Russian separatists in that war going on in eastern Ukraine. But both Ukraine and NATO have accused Russia of giving military backing to the rebels there. What's your view on the talks? And what solution would Russia like to see?
Well, first of all, I think it was the wrong place to hold these talks because all of France is aflame with a national strike and a simmering rebellion by the Yellow Vests. So Macron is very weak politically, so he has to play his game. Also, Angela Merkel is on her way out, and I don't understand why she is there at all, because she bears a lot of blame for what happened in her government in Ukraine in 2013 and 14. And there are no Americans. You know, we've listened to these impeachment hearings, and we now know how American ambassadors and State Department officials tell the Ukrainian government what to do and appoint people. Decide, whom to sack and whom to appoint. So the Americans have to be there. It's a very strange format, isn't it? When you don't have a key players and some of them are on the way out. But the good thing about these talks is that the two leaders met one-on-one without interpreters. That's always good. The bad thing is that when they said no conditions in 4 months we meet again, that meant they didn't achieve anything, and nothing will be achieved this year at all. All these promises are just promises. All these ceasefires, they have been announced and they didn't hold at all. So, it's like a sort of a strange balance when you say, yeah, it's good to talk, but there is no result. And nobody was expecting it, to be honest with you.
Ulrich Bruckner, the French President Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they brokered these talks. And we just heard Alexander tell us that in the case of Macron, he's very weak politically because of the protests in the country. And as far as Angela Merkel is concerned, she's on her way out. But were they effective? What would they like to see?
Well, I think it's an exaggeration to call Macron super weak and Merkel out of office, because she will be in office for another 2 years. And Macron is one of the strong, inspirational leaders of Europe in a situation where the European Union as a whole can form common position on a number of subjects. But when it comes to Russia, it is much more difficult given the different situation in Eastern Europe and the different traditions. For them, it was important to initiate something that could appear like a European initiative to moderate peace talks, to get the negotiations rolling and to get some results that make the life of people in the region, in the east of Ukraine, better. That's an important step. And it should also show that diplomacy could lead to something, that after 3 years of not negotiating, we are back on track, and Ukraine appears back in the light of the public attention.
What do you make of the fact, Ulrich, that the United States was not at the table?
Well, given the situation in the United States at the moment and how Ukraine is discussed there, it is understandable that the American president is not very interested in putting his weight in the negotiations and rather leaves it to the Europeans to find a solution in the European continent. But at the same time, it shows that Macron tries to declare not necessarily a declaration of independence from the United States, but tries to negotiate something like a framework in which Russia could play a role not as the #1 enemy, but someone with whom one could negotiate terms of conditions in the future, which is certainly not what East European countries would like to see happening, but this is clearly part of his bigger picture.
Andrij Dobriansky, there was also some progress made during these talks on a prisoner swap. Let's listen to what President Zelensky had to say about that.
Countries shall contribute to the release of all detainees before the 31st of December 2019 on the principle of all against all. It was decided to check all lists and provide full and unconditional access to Red Cross representatives to all detained persons.
Andrei, the other thing that the two sides agreed on is to meet in 4 months to resolve the issue of elections in eastern Ukraine that would lead to what the Russians would like to see, which is a special status for the region. How controversial is this special status?
Well, first and foremost, a foreign adversary invaded the country and is trying to dictate the terms of their constitution, the terms of their law. Again, in terms of the Ukrainian constitution, there's no possibility for having elections on occupied territory. To change the constitution, the entire country would have to vote on it. It's not something that can be done with a wave of a hand. So none of these demands are realistic by the Russians. It has no bearing on reality, and they simply regurgitate and reciprocate whatever they are being accused of onto the Ukrainians. So yesterday, Putin was saying that the Ukrainians need to defortify their own territory, as if we don't know from international observers, from the entire Western intelligence, that Russia was firing rockets onto Ukrainian territory. It's not the fact that Russia was supporting locals. It was the fact that Russia itself, the Russian military, has invaded Ukraine with Russian tanks, with Russian military. So when Putin tries to say that he's worried about the local population, that those poor people have a long wait in line to go through the line of demarcation into Ukraine, those are people who are going onto territory controlled by Ukraine so that they can get their government subsidies, so that they can get their medication. These are not people who are being supported by the occupying terrorists, the Russian government. So in terms of having the entire country of Ukraine vote in favor of changing their constitution to satisfy an invading force, one that has been condemned by the United Nations, condemned by most nations around the world, I don't think that's a realistic possibility. But a step-by-step procedure, meaning the prisoner exchange, President Zelensky later last night mentioned that we'll see what kind of lists of prisoners Russia offers. It may be completely incomplete, and that won't satisfy anybody.
Alexander, what do you make of what you've just heard? Russia invaded that part of Ukraine and now wants to call the shots on what kind of status it has and what kind of elections take place there.
Well, that's the problem. You see, my colleague talks in Soviet sort of style cliches, and he's actually believes himself that Russia invaded Ukraine, that there was no, coup. There was no support from the EU and Americans for the so-called protests that were actually a rebellion. And that's where the problem is. We talk in different languages. And because many people in the West don't know the history, they think, for example, that the Crimean War was fought between the English, the French, the Turks on the one side, and the Ukrainians on the other, not the Russians, who were there since then. You see, so it's very difficult to talk to anyone who doesn't really know history, who doesn't understand what happened. There would have been no Crimea if there would not have been a coup in Kiev, you see? So until we talk like that, in completely different language, we will not understand each other. That is the main problem.
All right.
In the West, people are not informed. That's the problem.
Okay.
They don't know the situation.
Andrei, a quick response from you, and then I want to go to Valentin.
There was an overwhelming vote at the United Nations just yesterday on Crimea and the increased militarization of it. The fact that I personally know the history of Crimea because of my work with the Crimean Tatar community, and the fact that those indigenous people were not only ethnically cleansed once from that peninsula, but 3 times by Russian occupiers. That is who's the rightful owners of that land, the indigenous people, the Ukrainian indigenous people, the Crimean Tatars.
Okay. Valentin Yakushik, I want to move on. There was a big rally in Kiev over the weekend in which demonstrators are warning President Zelensky not to give up too much, not to make too many concessions to President Putin. Is there concern that Zelensky could be pushed into concessions with Russia?
Some of these people are authentically believing that Zelensky is ready to make unnecessary and unacceptable concessions. And some are playing with these people. Like the former president and his team, they are exaggerating this situation. They have signed the Minsk agreements. They created the legal basis, the international basis for such solutions, and now they say, no, it's not possible to do that. Well, it's normal that in any revolution, and Ukraine has an aborted revolution, in 2013, 2014, there was an anti-bureaucratic, democratic revolution, a nationalistic revolution. It may be a kind of anti-imperialist against Russia, but pro-European. They tried to change the vector of their development. So, but then it was aborted, that revolution. The same oligarchs came to power, and now it seems that the same thing is happening. Zelensky promised anti-bureaucratic, anti-corruption solutions, and now there is a kind of merger of the previous regime people with the new people to whom 73% trusted. So the previous regime now wants to have more, to destabilize the new people who came to power, to do not to allow them to use so-called repressions or to take to the court those who plundered our economy, who mismanaged the country. So that kind of protest is manipulated.
Okay.
Some are authentically afraid, and some are using it. And as I told you before, there is another destabilization point on land sale. So you can see soon destabilization of Ukrainian situation, very soon.
Okay, Valentin. Ulrich Bruckner, Russia is currently under Western sanctions over what the West calls its aggression in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. We have heard President Macron of France, as well as Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, talk of Western re-engagement with Putin. Is that an indication to us that they would like to see these sanctions go away? Do they part ways with Washington as far as that is concerned?
Well, it certainly doesn't go as far as lifting sanctions just by the small step we have seen yesterday. But they are checking out new ways of negotiations because they are strongly believing in multilateral systems, the rule of law, and forms of diplomacy as a way out of the various problems that every one of the various actors is involved. So given the situation that Eastern Europe will certainly veto anything that sounds like a lift of sanctions if the situation in Crimea and the east of Ukraine will continue to be what it is. And at the same time, having Britain in a perspective of any form of appeasement is totally unacceptable. It's just one step to check out what the situation might allow. If a small window of opportunity opens, we should use it. We should get the OSCE on board, but it's way too early to think about something like lifting sanctions.
Andrij Dobriansky, if we look at the Ukrainian relationship with the United States, President Zelensky has also been caught up in these impeachment hearings that are taking place in the United States right now. There are also allegations that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election. Is there concern in Ukraine that U.S. support for the country may be weakening?
Well, that's not demonstrated by the continued relations between the two countries. First and foremost, Ukraine did not interfere. Ukraine did not attack the United States. That is a Russian talking point. All American intelligence agencies have verified that. In terms of the relationship, you just saw this weekend the acting ambassador, the charge d'affaires in Kyiv, Bill Taylor, put out a strong statement in support of Ukraine prior to the Normandy summit. You saw just this past month in November 3 very strong statements by the Ukrainian mission to the OSCE condemning Russian violations of ceasefire, condemning the fact that international monitors aren't getting access to the areas they need to oversee, as well as the many deployments of U.S. service members. That's not just Operation Rapid Trident, the training exercises that occur every year on Ukrainian territory, but the deployment of Ukrainian troops in support in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the active U.S. service members on Ukrainian territory, constantly training new members of the Ukrainian National Guard. This is a relationship that is strong. It is one that is enshrined both in the U.S.-Ukraine strategic partnership that was signed over a decade ago, as well as in current U.S. law. The U.S.-Ukraine Freedom Support Act specifically states that the United States will support Ukraine in regaining control of its sovereign territory. That's United States law. So no matter what you may hear from politicians, that's the policy and the official law of the United States.
Alexander Nekrassov, Russia, as we've just talked about, is under sanctions from Western nations. Is there some incentive then on the part of Russia to reach some kind of agreement with Ukraine so we could see some of the sanctions being lifted?
Well, I think that the position of the Kremlin is that it's practically impossible at the moment to get any deal over Ukraine with the West because, first of all, you must understand something. The West has nothing to do in Ukraine. Look what happened in Iraq, where the West interfered to establish democracy. Look at what's happening in it now. Look at Libya, look at Afghanistan, look at Yemen, look at, the list is endless. They leave a trail of destruction. They claim it's all for democracy, and they cause enormous problems. The Ukrainian crisis nearly caused World War III, by the way. So the first thing to do is for American troops to get the hell out of Ukraine and hopefully Europe, because this is becoming ridiculous. They've moved to the Russian border. They're calling Russia the aggressor at the same time. This is absurd.
Yeah. Just one point on that. One point on that, Alexander. One point on that. These are sovereign countries. Surely they are allowed to invite whomever they want to into their countries.
No. This doesn't work, Anand, with me, because NATO should not have even moved eastwards. It promised. The Americans gave a promise to Gorbachev. We will not move eastwards. And then this very cunning idea came in. But they are sovereign countries. They wanted to join NATO. You can't play tricks like that, especially if they can cause a war, which they can cause now, by the way. We are living in a more dangerous world because of America and NATO than under the Cold War situation. So I'm sorry, but these arguments will not work with us. There has to be an understanding that you can't stand on the border of some country and pretend you are democratic, and then you have a track record of destroying so-called independent countries because you wanted to do better. I'm sorry, that doesn't work.
Ulrich Bruckner, this conflict in Ukraine has caused probably the biggest rift between the East and West since the end of the Cold War. How important is it for Europe and for the United States as well to resolve these tensions between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, it's not an isolated case. It's not something that we either agree on it or we don't. The European Union is a very complex system in which basically every policy that matters for a country is more or less Europeanized. So foreign policy is certainly one important one, but it started as an economic club, and it is still first and foremost an economic club. And it's a guarantee for the European way of life that every sovereign state voluntarily choose to be part of. And that also counts for candidate countries or those who see their future being more Western or more European. So it's not about Europe or the European Union to expand further to the east and to transform artificially countries that used to be on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain and dominate them from Brussels. It's their own modernization strategy, and they choose where they want to belong to. So it's perfectly understandable if a country like Lithuania sees NATO and the European Union as their life insurance and urgently need the presence of foreign troops on their territory. Yep. But it is not the same perspective in Italy or in Hungary or in Portugal. And that's why we are far from speaking with one voice. We sound like a cacophonic orchestra in the European Union. Right. But it's not a matter of survival for the EU if we don't find a common denominator.
Valentin, I've only got a minute left, so I'd appreciate a very short and quick answer, please. Do you realistically expect that there will be a ceasefire, a prisoner swap, all that done in about 3 weeks' time, before the end of the year?
I do believe this because it's not difficult to do it. It was one of the promises of President Zelensky. It's like interim step towards further negotiations and further progress. Yes, yeah. Exchange of all detainees, all for all, stopping fighting there, and then preparing Ukrainian society for a compromise.
All right, we are going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.